Ethan Matthews had a long day at the office. As an accountant, the October rush was a familiar one, and he'd stayed late to finish up a particularly tricky set of books. It was already dark by the time he locked up and started the drive home, eager to surprise his wife, Rachel, with some takeout from their favorite local diner. He hadn't seen much of her recently, with work keeping him busy, but tonight was going to be different. He smiled to himself, imagining how happy she'd be to see him earlier than expected. Rachel had mentioned that his best friend, Derek, had stopped by earlier in the day to check in on her. The two of them had known each other since childhood, and Derek was always around, like a brother. Ethan trusted him completely. The drive home was peaceful. The radio played soft rock, and the usual traffic wasn't as bad as it could be. Pulling into his driveway, Ethan noticed something odd. Derek's car was still parked outside. He thought nothing of it at first. Maybe Derek had stayed longer than planned, helping Rachel with something. Derek was always willing to lend a hand. But as Ethan grabbed the takeout bags and approached the door, he saw the dim lights through the living room windows, and a strange feeling settled in his gut. The door was unlocked, which wasn't entirely unusual, but something felt off. He stepped inside quietly, thinking he might catch them in the middle of a conversation. Maybe they were having coffee, reminiscing about old times. But as he walked down the hallway, he heard voices coming from upstairs, faint, muffled sounds that immediately caused his heart to race. Ethan set the takeout on the kitchen counter and listened again. The voices were clearer now. Rachel's laughter mixed with Derek's low murmur. Curiosity twisted into a knot of unease. Why were they upstairs? It made no sense. Ethan's feet moved on their own, the creaking wooden steps betraying his silent approach. He stopped at the top, his breath shallow as the bedroom door came into view. It was slightly ajar, the soft glow of a bedside lamp casting shadows across the hall. Then he heard it, a sound that shattered everything. Rachel's laugh, different, intimate in a way Ethan hadn't heard before. His body tensed, his mind rejecting the thoughts racing through his head. Holding his breath, he pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Ethan stood frozen in place, the world crashing down around him. There, in his bed, was Rachel, tangled up with Derek in a way that needed no explanation. They were wrapped in each other, completely unaware of his presence. His mind spun, unable to fully grasp what he was seeing. Every detail struck him with gut-wrenching clarity. The way Rachel's hair fell across Derek's chest, the soft whispers exchanged between them, the intimacy Ethan thought belonged only to him. A wave of disbelief washed over him, then anger, a white-hot surge of emotion that made his fists clench at his sides. He fought the urge to storm into the room and confront them right then and there. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the sheer shock of the betrayal, or the fear of what he might say or do in the heat of the moment. Instead, he slowly backed away, his breath shaky, his heart pounding. He stumbled down the stairs, his thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. How long had this been going on? Was this a one-time thing? Or had he been blind to it for months, years even? Derek, his best friend, the one person he trusted more than anyone else, had shattered that trust in the worst way imaginable. And Rachel, his wife, the love of his life, had betrayed him in ways he couldn't yet process. Ethan sat on the couch in the dimly lit living room, his mind racing. He wanted answers, but he didn't trust himself to confront them yet. If he went back upstairs, if he burst through that door, what would happen? Rage boiled inside him, but mixed with it was a deep, painful sadness, a hollow ache in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to think. Should I call someone? Leave and clear my head? He thought about calling his brother, but what would he even say? No, that would come later. Right now, he needed to figure out what to do next. For a moment, he considered walking out of the house altogether, just disappearing, leaving Rachel to wonder where he had gone. But the thought of her waking up beside Derek in his house, as if nothing had happened, only fueled his anger. He couldn't leave. Not yet. As Ethan sat there, lost in his thoughts, he heard movement upstairs. Footsteps, muffled voices. They were coming downstairs. Instinctively, Ethan stood up, his heart pounding as adrenaline surged through him. He didn't know what was about to happen, but he knew he couldn't hide in the shadows any longer. Rachel's laugh echoed down the stairs, carefree and unaware of what was waiting for her at the bottom. The sound was like a knife twisting in Ethan's chest. He took a deep breath and prepared himself for the confrontation. The steps grew closer, and then Rachel and Derek appeared at the top of the staircase, laughing softly, their arms brushing against each other. When they saw Ethan standing there, the room fell into an icy silence. Rachel's face turned pale, her eyes wide with shock and guilt. Derek froze, his expression shifting from surprise to dread. Ethan didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, watching as realization dawned on them both. The betrayal hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Rachel was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "Ethan, I didn't know you were home." Ethan's eyes flicked from Rachel to Derek, the man who had been like a brother to him for as long as he could remember. How could they do this? The anger that had been simmering inside him threatened to boil over, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I wasn't supposed to be home this early," Ethan said quietly, his voice tight with emotion. "But here I am, and look what I walked in on." Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she took a hesitant step forward, but Ethan held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Don't," he said, his voice firm but strained. "Just don't." Derek, standing a few feet behind her, finally spoke up. "Ethan, man, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. It just—" Ethan turned to Derek, his voice cold as ice. "You didn't mean for this to happen?" he repeated, his disbelief cutting through the tension. "You didn't mean for this? Derek, you're my best friend. You've been in my life for years. And you're telling me this was just some kind of accident?" Derek shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Ethan's glare. "I don't know how it happened. It just, one thing led to another." "One thing led to another," Ethan echoed, his voice filled with bitterness. "And you ended up in my bed with my wife." Rachel tried to speak again, her voice trembling. "Ethan, please, I never wanted to hurt you. I don't even know what I was thinking." Ethan looked at her, the woman he had once loved with everything he had. "That's the problem, Rachel. You weren't thinking." The room went silent again, the weight of Ethan's words hanging between them. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know what to do next, didn't know how to move forward. The betrayal felt too deep, too raw. But one thing was clear. Everything had changed in an instant. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "I need you both to leave. Now." Rachel blinked in shock, her tears flowing freely. "Ethan, please don't do this." "I'm not doing this," Ethan cut her off, his tone sharp. "You did this. Both of you. And right now, I need you to get out. I need time to think." Derek looked like he wanted to argue, but one look at Ethan's face told him that now wasn't the time. Rachel stood there for a moment longer, sobbing quietly. She started to say something, but Ethan shook his head, turning away from her. "Just go." Without another word, Rachel and Derek left, closing the door softly behind them. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, the silence almost deafening now. He was alone, his heart broken, his life shattered. He sank down onto the couch, his hands shaking, and for the first time since walking into that room, he allowed himself to break down. Ethan sat in the quiet house, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The silence after Rachel and Derek left was overwhelming, almost suffocating. It felt like the walls were closing in, the familiar surroundings suddenly foreign and cold. His mind replayed the scene in the bedroom over and over, each replay sharper, more painful. The disbelief was still there, a dull ache that gnawed at his insides. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to ground himself, but nothing felt real. This was the house where they had built their life together, shared countless moments, planned a future. And now, in one evening, it was all shattered beyond repair. How could everything fall apart so quickly? It didn't seem possible, yet here he was. As he sat there, his phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him from the depths of his thoughts. He stared at it for a moment, not wanting to deal with anyone right now. But the buzzing didn't stop. Reluctantly, He picked it up and saw Rachel's name flashing on the screen. He let the call go to voicemail. Moments later, a text appeared. "Please, Ethan, let's talk. I'm so sorry." Ethan's jaw clenched as he stared at the words. Sorry. She's sorry. The word felt meaningless now, empty. It wasn't enough. Not for this. He tossed the phone aside, not ready to deal with her pleas for forgiveness. Not after what he had just witnessed. His mind kept wandering back to Derek. How could he do this? Derek, his best friend since childhood, the man who stood by his side at his wedding, who knew him better than anyone else. How long had they been lying to him? The question tore at Ethan, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Every memory of their friendship now felt tainted, like it had all been a facade. He needed air. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed his jacket and walked out the front door. The crisp night air hit him as he stepped onto the porch, the cool October breeze offering a small relief from the storm inside his head. He didn't have a destination in mind. He just needed to get away, even if it was only for a few minutes. The streets were quiet, the soft glow of streetlights illuminating the empty sidewalks. His footsteps echoed faintly as he walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, his thoughts swirling like a whirlpool he couldn't escape. Memories of Rachel and Derek kept flashing in his mind. The times they all hung out together, the laughter, the trust. It all felt like a cruel joke now, like he had been the punchline for their betrayal. Ethan found himself at the park down the street, a place he used to go with Rachel on lazy Sunday afternoons. The memories of their walks, hand in hand, now felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. He sat down on a bench near the playground, staring out at the empty swings swaying gently in the breeze. His mind drifted to the past few months, trying to piece together any signs he might have missed. Rachel had been more distant lately, distracted at times, but he had chalked it up to work stress or just the ebb and flow of married life. Derek, too, had been around a little less, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary until tonight. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. How could they both betray me like this? His fists clenched again, knuckles turning white as the anger simmered beneath the surface. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the sheer deception of it all. They had smiled in his face, acted like everything was fine, while sneaking behind his back. He thought of all the times he had invited Derek over for dinner, the nights he and Rachel had laughed together while Derek sat across from them. And all the while, they had been hiding this affair, lying to his face. The realization hit him like a wave, and he felt a surge of rage that nearly overwhelmed him. But then came the sadness, the deep, hollow sadness that felt like a pit opening up inside him. He had loved Rachel with everything he had. He had trusted Derek more than anyone. And now, all of it was gone, ripped away in an instant. Ethan sat there for what felt like hours, the anger and sadness ebbing and flowing in waves. He didn't know what to do next, didn't know how to move forward from this. His life had been turned upside down, and the future he had once envisioned seemed impossible now. Eventually, he pulled out his phone again. This time, he opened the text message from Rachel, reading her apology over and over. It was pathetic, really. One word, sorry, meant to fix everything that had just been destroyed. Another message appeared as he stared at the screen. Please, Ethan, I'm begging you. Can we talk? I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Ethan shook his head, his heart heavy. How could she not have meant it? She had made a choice. They both did. Every time they crossed that line, they chose to betray him. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't something that just happened. It was deliberate. It was cruel. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and stood up. The cold air was biting now, the wind picking up as the night wore on. But it didn't matter. He needed to think, needed space to process everything before he faced her again. As he walked back toward the house, his mind was clearer, though the pain hadn't lessened. He knew one thing for certain. There was no going back to how things were. Whatever happened next, this was the end of the life he once knew. He would have to rebuild, piece by piece, but not tonight. Tonight was for surviving the heartbreak, for accepting the brutal truth that his marriage and his friendship had both been shattered in the same cruel twist of fate. By the time Ethan made it back home, the house was as silent as when he had left. The takeout bags he'd brought earlier still sat on the counter, untouched, the food inside now cold. He stared at them for a moment, feeling an odd sense of detachment, as if the life he had been living just hours before was someone else's. A part of him had hoped that maybe this was all some terrible nightmare, that he would wake up and everything would be fine again. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was real. Too real. He walked into the living room, sinking back onto the couch where he had first sat after catching Rachel and Derek together. The weight of exhaustion settled over him, both physical and emotional. His mind was running in circles, unable to settle on a single thought for too long. He knew he needed to rest, but how could he sleep after what had just happened? His phone buzzed again. Another message from Rachel. This time, it was longer. He hesitated before opening it, knowing it would only bring more pain. But curiosity got the better of him. Ethan, I don't know how to explain this. I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know how things got so out of control, but please believe me, I still love you. This wasn't supposed to happen. Derek and I, it was a mistake. A terrible, awful mistake. Please, let me come home and talk. We need to fix this. Please. Ethan stared at the message, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. A mistake? She was calling it a mistake, as if that somehow made it better. As if it could be swept under the rug and forgotten with enough apologies. He stood up suddenly, pacing the length of the living room as his emotions surged once again. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Rachel and Derek had made a mockery of everything he had worked so hard to build. They had taken something sacred, his trust, and smashed it to pieces. But what hurt even more was Rachel's claim that she still loved him. How could she say that? How could she even pretend to love him while sneaking behind his back with someone else? Love didn't work like that. Love was trust, loyalty, respect, and she had destroyed all of those things. He wanted to call her, wanted to scream at her, demand answers, demand to know how she could do this to him. But deep down, he knew that no explanation would satisfy him. There was no justification for what she had done, no excuse that could undo the betrayal. Ethan stopped pacing and collapsed into an armchair, burying his face in his hands. His entire life had been turned upside down in the span of a few hours. He felt lost, like he was drifting in a storm with no direction, no safe harbor to turn to. The phone buzzed again, but this time, Ethan ignored it. He needed time to think, time to process what had just happened without Rachel's desperate pleas clouding his judgment. He needed to figure out what came next, and he couldn't do that if he was constantly bombarded with her messages. His eyes wandered to the framed photo on the fireplace mantel, a picture of him and Rachel on their wedding day. They were smiling, wrapped in each other's arms, looking happier than they had ever been. Ethan stared at the image, feeling a deep ache in his chest. How had they gone from that to this? It seemed impossible that the woman in that photo was the same one who had been lying to him. The Rachel he married would never have done something like this. Or at least, that's what he had thought. But maybe he had been wrong all along. Maybe he had been blind to who she really was, too trusting, too naive. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the pain. His mind flashed back to earlier in the evening, before everything had unraveled. The small things he had noticed but brushed off. The way Rachel had been distant, how she had seemed distracted, how Derek had started coming around less frequently. He had dismissed it all, thinking it was just the stress of life, of work. But now he saw it for what it really was, warning signs that he had ignored. How long had this been going on? Weeks? Months? Years? The thought made him sick to his stomach. He didn't want to know the answer, but at the same time, he felt like he needed to. He needed to know the full extent of the betrayal in order to even begin to move forward. But how could he move forward? The life he had envisioned, the future he had planned with Rachel, it was all gone now. He couldn't just pretend like nothing had happened. He couldn't look at her the same way, couldn't trust her again, not after this. Ethan sat there for what felt like hours, lost in thought, until finally, exhaustion began to take over. His body felt heavy, his mind dulled by the weight of everything he had just been through. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m., but sleep felt impossible. How could he rest when his world was falling apart? He glanced at his phone again. There were more messages from Rachel, but he didn't bother to open them. Not yet. Instead, He turned off the screen and let the silence of the house wash over him. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt truly alone. It was a terrifying feeling, this emptiness, this sense that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning came slowly. Ethan had barely slept, his mind too restless to allow him any peace. When he did manage to drift off, his dreams were plagued by images of Rachel and Derek, laughing, whispering, betraying him over and over. He woke up exhausted, his body heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. The sunlight creeping through the blinds did nothing to lift the dark cloud hanging over him. For a few moments, he just lay there on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to summon the energy to face the day. But the thought of what waited for him, the conversations, the explanations, the mess that had become his life, made him want to crawl back into bed and forget it all. His phone was still off, though he knew there were more messages from Rachel. She's probably panicking by now. He could imagine her sitting somewhere, waiting for a response, probably calling Derek and wondering what to do next. Ethan sat up slowly, rubbing his temples to ease the dull ache that had settled behind his eyes. He had never felt so drained, so lost. He had no idea what his next step was supposed to be. Should he call her? Should he confront Derek? Should he just pack up and leave for a while? Nothing seemed right. Nothing seemed to make sense anymore. The house was eerily quiet as he moved around the kitchen, making coffee more out of habit than actual need. He barely tasted it as he sat down at the table, staring at the empty chair where Rachel would usually sit. The chair where, for years, she had smiled at him over breakfast, where they had shared countless conversations about their plans, their future. That future seemed like a distant memory now, as if it had belonged to someone else entirely. The silence was broken by a knock at the door, a soft, tentative sound that made Ethan's heart skip. He knew who it was before he even stood up. Rachel. She must have come over, tired of waiting for him to respond to her messages. Ethan stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to turn away, to let her knock until she gave up and left. But he couldn't hide forever. He needed answers, even if they were answers he wasn't ready to hear. Taking a deep breath, he walked to the door and opened it. Rachel stood on the porch, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She looked small, fragile even, like a shadow of the woman he had known. She stared at him for a moment, her lips trembling as she tried to find the words to say. But for once, she didn't seem to know where to start. "Ethan, please, can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at her, feeling the anger and hurt swirl inside him like a storm. She looked so different now, like a stranger, someone who had destroyed everything without a second thought. But still, a part of him ached for her, remembering the life they had shared, the love they had once felt. Finally, he stepped aside, letting her in. Rachel walked into the living room, her movements hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she belonged there anymore. She stood in the center of the room, glancing around at the house they had made together, as if seeing it for the first time. The air between them was thick with tension, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them both. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her closely. "Talk," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Rachel flinched slightly, her eyes filling with tears again. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the guilt was evident on her face. "I don't even know where to start," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I never wanted this to happen. I swear, Ethan, I never meant to hurt you." "Then why did you?" Ethan's words cut through the air, filled with the pain he had been holding back all night. "How could you do this, Rachel? With Derek? My best friend?" She looked down at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. "I don't know," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't know what I was thinking. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It just happened." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "It just happened? That's your excuse? How many times did it just happen? Rachel, how long has this been going on?" Rachel swallowed hard, tears spilling down her cheeks. "A few months," she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible. "It started a few months ago." Ethan felt like he had been punched in the gut. Months. For months, They had been lying to him, betraying him, all while pretending like everything was fine. And what? You just thought I'd never find out? That you could sneak around with him behind my back forever? Ethan's voice was rising now, the anger bubbling up to the surface. Do you even understand what you've done? You destroyed everything. Rachel wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. I know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know I've ruined everything, and I hate myself for it. I was confused. I didn't know what I wanted. Ethan shook his head in disbelief. Confused? You were confused? You knew exactly what you were doing, Rachel. You made a choice, over and over again. You chose him. Rachel broke down into sobs, collapsing onto the couch. I know I did, and I regret it more than you can imagine. I never wanted this to happen. I love you, Ethan. I do. Ethan felt his chest tighten at her words. Love. How could she claim to love him after what she had done? If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this, he said quietly, the pain raw in his voice. You wouldn't have thrown everything away for him. Rachel sobbed harder, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. I'm so sorry, she whispered between sobs. I'm so sorry. Ethan stood there, watching her fall apart, feeling a strange mixture of anger and sadness. A part of him wanted to comfort her, to wrap his arms around her and make the pain go away. But another part of him, the part that had been betrayed, couldn't bring himself to do it. I don't know what to do, Rachel, Ethan said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I don't know how we come back from this. Rachel looked up at him, her eyes desperate, pleading. We can, Ethan. I know we can. Please, just give me a chance to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll go to counseling. I'll end things with Derek for good. Please, Ethan, don't give up on us. Ethan stared at her, the woman he had once promised to love forever, and felt the weight of her words. She wanted a second chance. She wanted to fix what was broken. But could it even be fixed? Could he ever trust her again? Could he ever look at her without seeing the betrayal, without remembering what she had done? I need time, Ethan said finally, his voice low and strained. I need time to think. Rachel nodded, wiping her tears away. Take all the time you need, she whispered. I'll be here, waiting. I'm not giving up on us. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. He turned away from her, walking toward the front door, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He needed space, needed to be alone to figure out what came next. As he stepped outside into the cool morning air, he felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't felt since the moment he caught them. Hope. It was faint, barely there, but it lingered in the back of his mind. A small flicker that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. But even as the thought crossed his mind, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan walked down the street aimlessly, letting the cool breeze calm his nerves. His mind was racing, and no matter how hard he tried to focus, everything kept coming back to that moment. Rachel and Derek together in his home, in his bed. He had never imagined something like this happening to him. Their lives, once so tightly woven together, now felt as though they were unraveling at the seams. As he walked, Ethan tried to clear his thoughts. He needed time. Time to think, to process, to decide what his next move would be. He couldn't let emotions cloud his judgment, not if he wanted to figure out how to move forward. But every time he thought about Rachel's tearful apology, her desperate pleas to fix things, it only made him feel more confused. Was it even possible to fix this? Deep down, Ethan knew that forgiveness wouldn't come easily. The image of Rachel and Derek, the two people he trusted most, lying to him, betraying him, it was burned into his memory. He had been blindsided by people he thought he knew better than anyone else. Now, all he could see were cracks in the foundation of their lives. But still, a part of him couldn't shake the love he had for Rachel. Despite the betrayal, despite the pain, there was a history between them that he couldn't simply erase. He had spent years building a life with her. They had shared dreams, hopes, moments of joy and struggle. It wasn't something he could throw away in an instant. Ethan found himself at the small neighborhood park again, the same place he had wandered to the night before. The swings were still gently swaying in the wind, and the sight of them brought back memories of simpler times. Times when things weren't so complicated. He sat down on the bench once more, letting the silence of the morning surround him. He closed his eyes, trying to sort through his emotions. His mind drifted back to when he and Rachel first met. They had been so young, so full of hope for the future. Their connection had been instant, a spark that quickly turned into something deeper. They had fallen in love fast, and the years that followed had been filled with laughter, love, and companionship. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. They had gotten comfortable, maybe even complacent. The spark that had once burned brightly between them had dimmed, and Ethan couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had happened. Life had gotten busy. Work, responsibilities, the mundane tasks of daily living. They had stopped putting in the effort, and before he knew it, they had drifted apart. Had that been the opening Rachel needed? Had Derek seen it and taken advantage? The thought made Ethan's stomach turn. He had never imagined Derek would betray him like this. Derek, the man who had stood by him through thick and thin, who had always been there when Ethan needed him. They had shared everything, adventures, secrets, triumphs, and defeats. And now, Derek had crossed a line Ethan never thought possible. Ethan pulled out his phone, staring at the blank screen. There were probably more messages from Rachel, but he didn't want to read them. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts until he found Derek's name. His finger hovered over it, the temptation to call his former friend strong. He wanted answers. He wanted to know how long this had been going on and why Derek thought it was okay to betray their friendship like this. But more than anything, Ethan wanted to hear Derek's voice and ask the one question burning in his mind. Why? With a deep breath, Ethan pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. He was about to hang up when Derek's voice came through the line. "Ethan," Derek said quietly, his voice laced with apprehension, "I wasn't expecting to hear from you." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to talk." There was a long pause on the other end. Derek's breath was audible, and Ethan could almost hear the guilt hanging in the air between them. "Yeah," Derek finally replied. "We do." "I want to know why," Ethan said, his voice hard. "I want to know why you thought it was okay to betray me like this. How long has this been going on, Derek? How long have you been lying to me?" Derek sighed, and Ethan could hear the regret in his voice. "I don't have a good answer for you, man. I wish I did. It started a few months ago, but it wasn't supposed to happen." Ethan clenched his jaw, trying to hold back the anger bubbling up inside him. "You keep saying that. It wasn't supposed to happen. But it did, Derek. You made a choice. You knew exactly what you were doing." "I know," Derek admitted, his voice low, "and I hate myself for it. Ethan, I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know what came over me. It was a mistake, a huge mistake." "A mistake?" Ethan repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "You didn't just trip and fall into this, Derek. You made a decision. Over and over again, you chose to keep going behind my back." Derek was silent for a moment, as if he couldn't argue with the truth in Ethan's words. "You're right. I did. And I wish I could take it all back." Ethan felt the weight of his own words settle over him. He had always been someone who believed in forgiveness, who believed people could change. But this felt different. This felt like a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. "What was it, Derek?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now. "Why her? Was it about me? Was it about ruining my life?" "No," Derek said quickly. "It was never about that. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Ethan. It just happened. I know that sounds like an excuse, but it's the truth. One day, Rachel and I were talking, and things escalated. We both knew it was wrong, but we couldn't stop." Ethan shook his head, his heart heavy with disappointment. "I trusted you, Derek. You were my best friend, and now I don't even know who you are." "I'm sorry, Ethan," Derek said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am. I wish I could go back and undo everything." Ethan closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath. Sorry. That word had become meaningless now. Rachel had said it, and now Derek was saying it. But sorry wouldn't fix the damage that had been done. Sorry wouldn't rebuild the trust that had been shattered. I need some time, Ethan said finally, his voice weary. I don't know what happens next. I need time to figure this out. I understand, Derek said quietly. Take all the time you need. I'm not going to push you. But please know, Ethan, I never wanted to lose your friendship. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. The pain of the betrayal was still too fresh, too raw. I'll talk to you later, Ethan said before hanging up. As he put the phone away, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions. There was anger, yes, but there was also a deep sadness, a sense of loss that weighed heavily on his chest. He had lost two people he cared about in one night, his wife and his best friend, and even though they were still physically present, nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan sat on the park bench for a long time after the call with Derek, staring out at the empty playground, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't quite organize. The conversation had left him feeling hollow. There was no satisfaction in hearing Derek's apology, no sense of closure. Derek had tried to explain, tried to say the right things, but none of it mattered now. The damage had already been done. A part of him had hoped for more, some kind of explanation that would make sense of it all, some reason that would allow him to understand why this had happened. But there was no reason that could make it okay. Derek had betrayed him, and Rachel had, too. No amount of words could take that away. Eventually, Ethan stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. He needed to get moving, needed to do something to distract himself from the crushing weight of his emotions. He walked back through the neighborhood, the streets quiet in the early morning light, his mind turning over the same questions again and again. What was he supposed to do now? Could he really rebuild his life after this, or was everything too far gone? When he arrived home, the house felt colder than ever, the silence pressing in on him. Ethan hesitated before opening the door, knowing that Rachel was probably still there, waiting for him, desperate for another chance to talk. He wasn't sure he was ready to face her again. He didn't know what he'd say, or how he'd react. The sight of her crying earlier had stirred something in him, memories of their life together, of the love they had shared. But it also made him angry, angry that she had shattered everything. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped inside. Rachel was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face still pale and drawn. Her eyes were puffy, evidence that she had been crying while he was gone. She looked up as he entered, her expression filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Ethan," she began softly, her voice shaky. I didn't know if you were coming back." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, taking a long drink to calm his nerves. He could feel Rachel's eyes on him, waiting for him to say something, anything. Finally, he turned to face her. "I talked to Derek." Rachel's breath caught, and she looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting nervously. What did he say?" Ethan set the glass down on the counter, crossing his arms as he leaned against the kitchen island. "He said the same thing you did, that it was a mistake, that it wasn't supposed to happen." Rachel nodded, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't supposed to. It's true. Is that really all you have to say?" Ethan's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. That it was a mistake? Rachel looked up at him, her eyes filled with guilt. "What do you want me to say, Ethan? I don't have an excuse. I can't explain why it happened. All I can tell you is that I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can believe that anymore, Rachel. If you didn't want to hurt me, why did you keep doing it? Why didn't you stop?" "I tried," Rachel whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I swear, I tried. But I was confused, and Derek was, I don't know. I felt like I was losing you, and I made the worst decision of my life." Ethan shook his head, his heart heavy. "Losing me? Rachel, you didn't lose me. I was right here. But you never talked to me, never told me you felt that way. You just went behind my back." Rachel wiped at her eyes, her tears starting to flow again. I know I should have talked to you, but I didn't know how. And by the time I realized how far things had gone, it was too late. I didn't know how to undo the damage." Ethan felt a pang of sadness as he listened to her, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Why hadn't she trusted him enough to come to him? They had been married for years, built a life together. He had always been there for her, always tried to be the partner she needed. But she hadn't given him a chance to fix things before turning to Derek. Do you love him? Ethan's voice was quiet, but the question hung heavily in the air. Rachel's eyes widened in shock. No, I don't love him. I never did. Ethan, it was never about that. It was never about love. Then what was it about? Ethan asked, his voice growing sharper. Because I can't figure it out. If you didn't love him, if you didn't want to hurt me, then why did you risk everything? Rachel shook her head, her tears falling freely now. I don't know. I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't. I was selfish. I was confused. I let myself get caught up in something I didn't understand, and now I've ruined everything. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his emotions swirling inside him. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this was something they could work through, that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to save what they had. But he wasn't sure he could. Not after everything that had happened. He looked down at the floor, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy blanket. I don't know if I can forgive this, Rachel. Rachel's breath hitched, and she stood up, walking toward him. Please, Ethan. Please don't say that. I'll do anything to make this right. I'll go to therapy. We can go to counseling. I'll cut all ties with Derek. Just, please, don't give up on us. Ethan felt his chest tighten at the desperation in her voice. He could see how much she was hurting, how much she regretted what had happened. But regret wasn't enough. Not this time. I don't know if it's that simple, Ethan said quietly. You and Derek, you broke something, Rachel. And I don't know if it can be fixed. Rachel's tears flowed faster, and she reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Ethan, I love you. I swear I do. I made a mistake, a horrible, unforgivable mistake, but I don't want to lose you. Ethan closed his eyes, the pain in his chest almost unbearable. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to hold on to the hope that they could get past this. But every time he looked at her, all he could see was the betrayal. All he could feel was the hurt. I need time, Ethan said again, his voice strained. I can't make any decisions right now. I need to be alone. Rachel nodded slowly, her face crumpling as fresh sobs escaped her. Okay, she whispered. I understand. Ethan turned and walked toward the front door, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know what he would do next. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stay here, not now. As he stepped outside, the cool breeze hit his face, bringing with it a sense of clarity, if only for a moment. The road ahead was uncertain, and the path forward would be filled with difficult choices. But for now, Ethan needed space. Space to think, space to breathe, space to figure out whether the life he had known was truly over, or if there was still something worth saving. Ethan didn't know how long he walked. The sun was higher in the sky now, warming the cool air, but it did nothing to ease the chill that had settled deep inside him. His feet seemed to move on their own, carrying him further away from the house, from Rachel, from everything that now felt like a stranger to him. He ended up in a small cafe on the edge of town, a place he and Rachel used to visit on lazy Saturday mornings when things were simpler, before everything had become so complicated. It was strange being there now, alone, but it was the only place that felt remotely familiar. Ethan ordered a coffee, barely registering the barista's friendly smile as he took a seat by the window. The cafe was quiet, the murmur of conversations and clinking dishes a soft background noise that almost lulled him into a sense of calm. But his thoughts were still a storm, swirling with questions he didn't have the answers to. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, staring out the window at the people passing by. Life was going on around him. Normal, untroubled lives, completely unaware of the turmoil he was in. He envied them. They didn't have to deal with the betrayal of a spouse or the broken trust of a lifelong friend. They didn't have to face the possibility that everything they had built was now crumbling beneath them. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, and for a moment, he considered ignoring it. He had already heard all the apologies he could stomach for one day. But something made him pull it out, if only to distract himself for a moment. It wasn't Rachel. It was a message from his brother, Greg. "Hey man, you all right? Haven't heard from you in a while. Let me know if you want to grab a beer or something later." Ethan stared at the message, feeling a pang of guilt. He hadn't told Greg anything yet. In fact, he hadn't told anyone about what had happened. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't even know how to begin. How do you explain to someone that your whole world has just collapsed? His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to type. Part of him wanted to reach out, to unload everything onto Greg, to hear his brother's familiar voice and feel some sense of comfort. But the other part of him, the part that was still reeling from the shock, didn't know if he could handle the conversation yet. It would make everything more real, more final. Instead, he typed a short response, "Thanks. Going through some stuff right now, but I'll let you know." He hit send and slid the phone back into his pocket, feeling more alone than ever. The door to the cafe jingled as someone walked in, and Ethan's eyes flicked up automatically. To his surprise, it wasn't just anyone. It was Derek. Ethan's stomach twisted into a knot as he watched Derek step up to the counter, ordering a coffee like everything was normal. For a moment, Ethan considered getting up and leaving before Derek saw him. But it was too late. Derek turned, coffee in hand, and froze when his eyes landed on Ethan. For a second, neither of them moved. Derek's expression shifted from shock to discomfort, his guilt written all over his face. He hadn't expected to run into Ethan. Not here, not now. Ethan didn't know what to do. A part of him wanted to stand up and walk out, leave Derek to stew in his shame. But another part of him, angry, hurt, and confused, wanted answers. Derek had been his best friend for years. He owed Ethan an explanation, no matter how painful it might be. Derek hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the table, his steps slow, almost reluctant. "Ethan," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "Can I sit?" Ethan stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "Yeah, sit." Derek lowered himself into the chair across from Ethan, setting his coffee down on the table. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around as if he wasn't sure how to start. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't expect to see you here," Derek said, his voice low. "Neither did I," Ethan replied, his tone cold. "But here we are." Derek looked down at the table, fidgeting with the edge of his coffee cup. "Ethan, I know I've already said it, but I'm so sorry, man. I don't know what else to say." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had heard enough apologies to last a lifetime. "Why, Derek? Just why?" Derek's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Ethan saw how tired he looked. He wasn't the carefree, confident guy Ethan had known for years. He looked worn out, broken even, by the weight of his own mistakes. "I don't know," Derek admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wish I had a better answer for you, but I don't. It just happened. One day, we were hanging out, talking like we always do, and then things started to change. I didn't stop it when I should have, and once it started, I couldn't pull myself out of it." Ethan stared at him, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "You couldn't pull yourself out of it? Are you serious? You had months to pull yourself out of it, Derek, but you didn't. You just kept going." Derek nodded, his guilt evident. "You're right. I should have stopped it. I should have told you. But I was scared, Ethan. Scared of losing our friendship, scared of what it would mean for Rachel. I messed up. I know that." Ethan clenched his fists under the table, trying to keep his emotions in check. "You didn't just mess up, Derek. You destroyed everything. You took something that wasn't yours, my marriage, my trust, and you broke it." Derek's eyes were filled with shame. "I know, Ethan. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to make it right, somehow. I don't know how, but I'll do whatever it takes." Ethan looked at him, the man he had once considered his closest friend, and felt a wave of sadness wash over him. He didn't know if there was a way to make this right. How could Derek fix something so deeply broken? "I don't know if you can," Ethan said quietly. "I don't know if there's anything left to fix." The two men sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their words hanging between them. Derek looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. He just sat there, staring into his coffee, his guilt and regret palpable. Finally, Ethan stood up, tossing a few bills onto the table to cover his coffee. I need some time, Derek. I don't know what happens next, but right now, I can't deal with this. I can't deal with you. Derek looked up at him, his face a mixture of sorrow and understanding. I get it, Ethan. Take all the time you need. Ethan didn't say anything else. He turned and walked out of the cafe, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him like a boulder. As he stepped back into the daylight, he felt a sense of finality settle over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: things would never be the same. Ethan drove aimlessly for hours after leaving the cafe, the weight of everything pressing down on him with no relief in sight. His conversation with Derek hadn't brought him the answers or the closure he had hoped for. If anything, it had left him feeling more adrift, more uncertain about what to do next. Derek's regret, Rachel's pleas for forgiveness, it all blurred together, a tangled mess of emotions that Ethan couldn't sort out. He found himself parked near a small overlook just outside town, the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon. The colors of the sky, soft pinks and oranges, were beautiful, almost peaceful, but they felt distant, like they belonged to a world he no longer understood. He sat in his car, staring out at the view, but his thoughts kept circling back to Rachel and Derek. Was there any way forward? He couldn't picture it. Not yet. Every time he thought about forgiving Rachel, about trying to rebuild their life, the image of her with Derek flashed in his mind, tearing at him. Trust was the foundation of a marriage, and Rachel had shattered that. Could it ever be rebuilt? Could he ever look at her the same way again, without seeing the betrayal in her eyes? Ethan leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to steady himself. He had spent so long being the steady one, the calm, rational voice in their relationship, the person who could solve problems, fix things. But this felt unfixable. Every solution he came up with felt like a dead end, leading him back to the same question. Was their marriage already over? The thought terrified him. Divorce had never been part of his plan, never something he even considered. His parents had been married for 40 years, and Ethan had always admired the strength of their bond, the way they worked through things together, no matter what. He had always wanted that for himself and Rachel. He had imagined them growing old together, building a life full of memories. But now that dream seemed shattered beyond repair. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. He hesitated before looking at it, half expecting another message from Rachel, or maybe even Derek. But it wasn't either of them. It was Greg. Hey, just checking in again. Seriously, let me know if you need to talk. Something's clearly up, and I'm worried about you, bro. Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, his chest tightening. Greg had always been the one person he could count on, the one who would listen without judgment, offer advice when it was needed, but never push too hard. Maybe it was time to let someone else in. Maybe it was time to stop carrying this burden alone. Before he could change his mind, Ethan dialed Greg's number. It only rang once before Greg picked up. Ethan, man. Finally. You had me worried. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the steering wheel, his breath coming out in a slow sigh. Yes, sorry, Greg. I've just had a lot on my mind. I can tell. You sound like you've been through the ringer, Greg said, his tone shifting from casual to concerned. What's going on? Ethan wasn't sure where to start. The words felt stuck in his throat, the weight of what he was about to say suddenly too heavy to speak aloud. But Greg was his brother. If anyone would understand, it was him. So Ethan took a deep breath and began to tell him everything. He told Greg about Rachel's affair with Derek, about how he had caught them together, and about the gut-wrenching conversations that had followed. He spared no detail, not because he wanted to relive it, but because he needed Greg to understand the full scope of what had happened. By the time he finished, his voice was hoarse, his emotions raw and exposed. Greg was silent for a long moment, absorbing it all. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with quiet disbelief. Jesus, Ethan, I don't even know what to say. That's horrible, man. Ethan swallowed hard, his chest tightening. Yeah, it is. I can't believe Derek would do that to you, Greg continued, anger creeping into his voice. He was like family. And Rachel, I mean, damn, I don't know how you're holding it together right now. I don't know if I am, Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I feel like everything I thought I knew has just fallen apart. Greg sighed, and Ethan could hear the sympathy in his brother's voice. I get that, man. I can't imagine how hard this is. But listen, you don't have to figure it all out right now. You don't have to make any decisions today. Ethan leaned back in his seat, staring out at the fading sunset. That's the thing, though, Greg. I don't know if there's anything left to figure out. How do you come back from this? How do you forgive something like this? Greg was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. I don't know if you can, Ethan. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but trust like that, once it's broken, it's hard to rebuild. And it's okay if you can't. It's okay if you decide you need to walk away. Ethan felt a lump forming in his throat. Walking away felt like giving up. It felt like admitting defeat, like everything he had built with Rachel had been for nothing. But at the same time, the idea of staying, of trying to rebuild something so deeply fractured, felt unbearable. I don't want to give up, Ethan said quietly, but I don't know if I can stay either. Greg's voice softened. Then take some time, man. Don't rush into anything. Give yourself space to figure out what you really want. And if you need to get away for a while, come stay with me. I've got a spare room, and you know you're always welcome here. Ethan smiled faintly at his brother's offer. Greg had always been the dependable one, the one who could be counted on no matter what. Thanks, Greg. I might take you up on that. Anytime, Greg replied. And listen, no matter what happens, I've got your back. Whether you decide to try and work things out with Rachel or whether you walk away, I'll support you either way. You don't have to go through this alone. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude for his brother. He had been carrying the weight of this betrayal on his own for days, feeling like the world was crumbling around him. But now, with Greg's support, the burden felt just a little bit lighter. I appreciate that, Greg, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. I really do. Hey, that's what brothers are for, Greg said with a grin that Ethan could hear through the phone. Now, why don't you come over tonight? We'll order some takeout, have a few beers, and forget about all this crap for a while. Ethan chuckled softly. You know, that doesn't sound too bad. Good. I'll text you the address, Greg replied. And Ethan, don't be too hard on yourself, all right? You didn't cause this. You're just trying to figure out how to deal with it. Ethan nodded, even though Greg couldn't see him. Yeah, thanks. They said their goodbyes, and Ethan sat there for a moment, staring at his phone. For the first time in days, he felt a sliver of relief, a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could get through this. Maybe he didn't have to make any big decisions right now. Maybe all he needed was time, space, and the support of the people who truly cared about him. As the last rays of the setting sun disappeared behind the horizon, Ethan started his car and headed toward Greg's place. He didn't know what the future held, but at least for tonight, he didn't have to face it alone. The drive to Greg's place was quieter than usual, but for once, Ethan didn't mind the silence. It gave him time to think, time to let the conversation with his brother sink in. He didn't feel as lost as he had before, and Greg's offer to come over, to take some of the weight off his shoulders, felt like a lifeline. He pulled into Greg's driveway a little after dusk, parking behind his brother's beat-up pickup truck. The familiar sight of Greg's house, with its cozy front porch and warm lights glowing from inside, gave Ethan a sense of comfort. He hadn't realized how much he needed this, just to be with someone who knew him, someone who could make him feel grounded again. Greg was already at the door by the time Ethan got out of the car, a wide grin on his face as he stepped out onto the porch. There he is, Greg called out, waving him inside. Come on in, bro. I ordered some wings and pizza. Figured we could do it up old school. Ethan smiled, feeling a bit lighter for the first time in what seemed like days. Wings and pizza, huh? Just like college. Greg chuckled. Exactly. Except this time, no frat parties afterward. Ethan followed Greg inside, the smell of freshly delivered food filling the small but welcoming space. Greg's house wasn't large, but it was homey, full of mismatched furniture and a few hand-me-downs from their parents. It wasn't fancy, But it was comfortable, and right now, that's all Ethan needed. Greg motioned for him to sit on the couch, pushing a beer into his hand before taking a seat himself. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, digging into the food without much conversation. It felt good not to have to talk, not to have to explain anything. Greg knew when to push and when to just let things be, and right now, Ethan was grateful for the latter. After a while, Greg leaned back in his chair, wiping his hands on a napkin. "So, you want to talk about it?" Ethan sighed, taking a long sip of his beer before setting it down. "I don't even know where to start." "Start wherever you need to," Greg said simply. "I'm not going anywhere." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared down at the half-eaten slice of pizza on his plate. "It's just everything. Everything feels broken. Rachel's been apologizing nonstop, Derek's been groveling, but none of it feels real. It's like I'm stuck in this nightmare, and no matter what I do, I can't wake up." Greg nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get it. And trust me, it's going to feel like that for a while. But you're not stuck, Ethan. You've got options, man. It might not feel like it now, but you've got the power to decide what happens next." Ethan stared at his brother, the words sinking in. Options. The word almost felt foreign, as if the weight of the situation had made him forget that he still had a choice in all of this. For the past few days, he had felt like everything was out of his control, like Rachel and Derek had made decisions for him that he hadn't asked for, hadn't wanted. But Greg was right. He still had a say in what happened next. "I don't even know what I want," Ethan admitted, his voice quiet. "Part of me wants to try to fix it, to salvage what's left of our marriage. But another part of me feels like it's too far gone. Like no matter what I do, I'll never be able to trust her again." Greg didn't respond right away, giving Ethan the space to keep talking. "I thought Rachel and I were solid, you know? I thought we'd built something that could survive anything. But now it just feels like I've been living in a lie. And Derek, God, I've known him since we were kids. I never thought he'd do something like this." Ethan ran a hand over his face, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. "It just feels like everything I believed in was a lie." Greg shifted in his chair, his eyes soft with sympathy. "Ethan, nobody can tell you what to do here. This is your call. But I'll say this, you don't have to rush into anything. I know it feels like you've got to make a decision right now, but you don't. You can take your time. And if you need space, if you need to get away from it all for a bit, that's okay too." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He had been so focused on trying to fix everything immediately, trying to find a solution to the mess, that he hadn't considered giving himself permission to not decide, at least not right away. Maybe Greg was right. Maybe time was what he needed most. "What if I can't ever get past it?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if no matter how much time passes, I can't look at her the same way again?" Greg leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees as he looked Ethan square in the eye. "Then that's your answer. But you'll never know until you've given yourself time to heal. Right now, you're in the thick of it. You're drowning in all the emotions, the betrayal, the anger. You can't see straight. But once things settle, once you've had a chance to really process everything, you'll know what's right for you." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. What if there's nothing to salvage? Greg's expression softened. "Then you move on. And that's okay, too. Sometimes, things break and they can't be put back together. It sucks, but it's not the end of the world. You're stronger than you think, Ethan. You'll get through this, one way or another." Ethan stared down at his beer, his thoughts heavy. Was that the reality? Was this marriage beyond repair? Was there even a version of the future where he could trust Rachel again? He didn't know. He wasn't ready to answer that yet. But for the first time in days, he felt like it was okay not to know. "I think I need some space," Ethan said finally, his voice steady. "I need to get away from her, from everything, just for a little while. Clear my head. Figure out what I want." Greg nodded, his face calm and understanding. "You can stay here as long as you need. There's no rush." Ethan smiled faintly, grateful for his brother's support. "Thanks, Greg. I think I'll take you up on that." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, the sounds of the TV filling the space between them as the evening wore on. Ethan felt the weight of his emotions start to lift, if only slightly. He still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he had a path forward, like he could take things one step at a time, without the pressure to fix everything at once. For now, he had space. He had time. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Ethan spent the night at Greg's place, tossing and turning on the spare bed. He was grateful for the quiet, for the space away from Rachel and the suffocating atmosphere of their home, but sleep still didn't come easily. His mind refused to rest, constantly replaying the past few days, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the conversations that had only left him feeling more conflicted. As the early morning light filtered through the window, Ethan finally gave up on sleep. He rolled out of bed and pulled on a hoodie, moving quietly through Greg's small house so as not to wake him. The kitchen was still dark as Ethan poured himself a glass of water, his thoughts swirling. It was strange being here, in this unfamiliar space, but it also felt safe. He didn't have to face Rachel's tearful apologies or Derek's remorseful voice. Here, it was just him and his thoughts, free from the chaos that had turned his life upside down. As he sipped his water, Ethan's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen, expecting another message from Rachel, but this time, it was an email. He didn't recognize the sender, but the subject line made his heart stop for a moment. "I'm sorry about everything." For a brief second, Ethan's mind raced. He wondered if Derek had sent some kind of long apology, or if Rachel had chosen a different way to reach him after he'd left the house. But when he opened the email, he felt a wave of confusion wash over him. It wasn't from Rachel or Derek. It was from someone else entirely. "Ethan, you don't know me, but I've known Derek for a while now. I found your contact through mutual connections and wanted to reach out because I feel like you deserve to know the truth. This thing with Rachel and Derek isn't new, and it's not the first time. I know that's probably hard to hear, but it's something you need to know." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he read the words over and over again. Not the first time? What did that mean? He hadn't considered the possibility that there had been others. The betrayal with Rachel was bad enough, but this was something entirely different. He scrolled down, the email continuing. "I've been in a similar situation with Derek. I'm not proud of it, and I don't want to cause you more pain, but I know what he's capable of. He's been involved with other people, both before and after Rachel, and I think you deserve to know the full picture before you decide what to do. I'm sorry for being the bearer of bad news, but I couldn't stay silent any longer. If you want to talk more, I'm here. You're not alone in this." Ethan stood frozen, his mind reeling. More people. Derek had been involved with others, and not just Rachel. The weight of it hit him like a punch to the gut. Everything he had believed about Derek, about their friendship, about the man he thought he knew, crumbled even further. He set the phone down, his hands trembling. For a moment, he couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The betrayal had been bad enough, but this made everything worse. It made him feel like a fool, like he had been blind to who Derek really was all along. Ethan leaned against the counter, trying to steady himself. He felt sick to his stomach, the pain of the betrayal cutting deeper than before. He had spent years trusting Derek, confiding in him, relying on him, and all the while, Derek had been lying, not just about Rachel, but about who he truly was. Ethan's mind raced. How many people had Derek hurt like this? How many lies had he told, pretending to be a friend, a confidant, while sneaking around behind their backs? The thought made Ethan's skin crawl. He glanced back at his phone, considering the email again. Whoever this person was, they clearly knew more about Derek than Ethan had realized. But did he want to reach out? Did he want to open this door and learn more? Or was it better to leave it alone, to take the betrayal he already knew and figure out how to deal with it? Before he could decide, there was a knock at the front door. Ethan tensed, his thoughts still racing from the email. He wasn't expecting anyone, and Greg wasn't awake yet, so he didn't know who could be at the door this early. He opened it cautiously, half expecting to see Rachel standing there. But it wasn't her. It was Derek. Ethan's heart dropped. Derek stood on the porch, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His face was drawn, his eyes red, and he had the look of someone who had been through hell. He held up a hand in a gesture of peace, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to respond. "Ethan," Derek began, his voice rough, "I know this is the last thing you want right now, but I need to talk to you. I need to explain." Ethan stared at him, a wave of anger rising in his chest. He thought of the email he had just read, the accusations that Derek had been involved with others, not just Rachel. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What do you need to explain, Derek?" Ethan asked coldly, his voice steady despite the fury simmering inside him. "That you betrayed me with Rachel? That you lied to me? Or is there more?" Derek looked taken aback, his brow furrowing in confusion. "More? What do you mean?" Ethan stepped outside, shutting the door behind him as he faced Derek. "I got an email this morning. From someone who knows you, someone who says you've done this before. That Rachel isn't the first person you betrayed me with." Derek's face went pale, his mouth opening slightly in shock. He swallowed hard, looking like he had been caught off guard. I don't know what you're talking about." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his anger boiling over. "Don't lie to me, Derek. Not now. I'm already dealing with enough without finding out there's more to this story than you're letting on." Derek ran a hand through his hair, his voice shaking as he spoke. "Ethan, I swear to you, Rachel was the only one. I know that doesn't make it better, but it's the truth. I haven't been with anyone else. I don't know who would send you something like that, but it's not true." Ethan's mind raced as he tried to decide whether to believe him. He wanted to, for a moment. A small part of him still clung to the hope that maybe Derek wasn't as monstrous as he seemed. But the email had planted a seed of doubt, and now Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Derek wasn't telling the whole truth. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Ethan said, his voice filled with bitterness. "You've lied to me for months, Derek. You've slept with my wife behind my back. How am I supposed to trust anything you say now?" Derek looked down, guilt washing over his face. "You're right. I know I've destroyed everything, and I don't expect you to trust me again. But I'm telling the truth now. There was no one else." Ethan stood there, torn between his anger and the years of friendship that still lingered in his heart. He wanted to believe that Derek was telling the truth, but the betrayal had cut too deep. Trust didn't come easily, not after everything that had happened. "I need you to leave," Ethan said finally, his voice flat. "I can't do this right now. I need space, and I need you to stay away." Derek hesitated, his eyes pleading. "Ethan, please." "I said leave," Ethan snapped, the anger in his voice leaving no room for argument. Derek took a step back, his face falling. He nodded slowly, the weight of his actions clearly bearing down on him. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll go. But if you ever want to talk, if you ever need anything, I'll be here." Without another word, Derek turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing on the porch, his heart pounding in his chest. Ethan watched him go, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and something else, something that felt dangerously close to sorrow. He had never imagined that his friendship with Derek would end like this, in a storm of lies and broken trust. But here they were, and nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan stood on the porch for a long time after Derek left, his mind reeling from the confrontation. The cold morning air did nothing to cool the fire of anger burning inside him. He wanted to believe Derek, wanted to hold onto the sliver of hope that maybe Rachel had been the only one. But after everything, how could he trust anything Derek said? Every word felt like another layer of deception. The email still gnawed at him. If Rachel wasn't Derek's first betrayal, how many others had there been? How many lies had he been living under? The thought made Ethan sick. He had already felt like his world was crashing down, but this new information threatened to pull the rug out from under him completely. He stepped back inside Greg's house, the warmth of the small space wrapping around him like a blanket. The silence was thick, and for the first time since the betrayal, Ethan realized just how alone he felt. He had distanced himself from Rachel, cut ties with Derek, and now, standing in the middle of his brother's kitchen, he wasn't sure where to turn next. Greg emerged from his bedroom, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Hey, I heard the door. Was that Derek?" Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, it was him." Greg's brow furrowed as he poured himself a cup of coffee. What did he want? To explain. To beg for forgiveness, I guess. Ethan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. He claims there was no one else. That Rachel was the only one. Greg sipped his coffee, watching his brother carefully. And do you believe him? Ethan let out a bitter laugh. I don't know. I want to believe that this nightmare isn't as bad as it seems. But, he trailed off, pulling out his phone and opening the email again. He handed it to Greg without a word, watching as his brother's eyes scanned the message. Greg's face darkened as he read, his mouth set in a grim line by the time he was finished. This is from someone else who knew Derek? Greg asked, his voice low. Yeah, Ethan said, his voice strained. Whoever they are, they claim Derek's done this before. That he's betrayed other people, and not just with Rachel. Greg set the phone down, his expression hardening. That piece of, he cut himself off, taking a deep breath before he continued. If that's true, then Derek's been lying to you for longer than you think. It's not just about Rachel. It's about who he is, what kind of person he's always been. Ethan clenched his fists, feeling the weight of Greg's words settle over him. But how do I know for sure? How do I know if this email is telling the truth, or if it's just someone trying to stir the pot? Greg was silent for a moment, considering. You could reach out. Ask whoever sent it for more information. Ethan hesitated. Part of him wanted to know the full truth, but another part of him was terrified of what he might find. What if this email opened a door to even more betrayals, more lies? Could he handle that? Did he want to? I don't know if I can deal with more lies, Greg, Ethan said quietly. I feel like I'm barely holding it together as it is. Greg stepped closer, resting a hand on Ethan's shoulder. I get that, man, but the truth is already out there. Whether you dig into it or not, it's still there. And if it's true, don't you want to know? Don't you deserve to know? Ethan stared at the phone, his mind racing. Greg was right. If Derek had betrayed him before, if there were others, then that was the truth. And no matter how painful, Ethan had a right to know what kind of man Derek really was. He couldn't live in the dark any longer. He nodded slowly, taking the phone back from Greg. You're right. I need to know. Greg watched him for a moment, then stepped back, giving Ethan the space he needed. Whatever you decide, I'm here, all right? You're not in this alone. Ethan managed a small smile, grateful for Greg's support. Thanks. With a deep breath, Ethan sat down at the kitchen table and began typing a reply to the email. His hands shook slightly as he wrote, but his words were steady. I received your email this morning. I appreciate you reaching out, though I'm still trying to process everything. You said Derek has been involved with others before Rachel. Can you tell me more? I need to know the full truth before I can figure out what to do next. He hit send before he could second-guess himself, setting the phone aside with a heavy sigh. Now all he could do was wait, and hope that the response would bring some clarity to the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The hours dragged by slowly, each minute feeling longer than the last. Ethan tried to distract himself by helping Greg clean up around the house, but his thoughts kept returning to the email. What would this person reveal? What more could Derek possibly have done? The thought made Ethan's stomach churn. By mid-afternoon, the familiar buzz of his phone broke the silence. His heart jumped into his throat as he grabbed it, the notification confirming what he had been waiting for. An email response. He opened it quickly, his pulse racing. I'm sorry for how vague I was in my first email. I know how hard this must be for you. Derek and I were involved a few years ago, before he was with Rachel. He was seeing someone else at the time, too, a mutual friend. I didn't know about her at first, but when I found out, I cut things off. I felt sick knowing I had been part of something that hurt someone else. I've since learned that Derek has a history of this. He's been with several women, most of whom don't know about each other. I wish I had spoken up sooner, but I thought it wasn't my place. Now, I realize I should have told you the truth earlier. I hope this helps, though I know it's not what you want to hear. Ethan stared at the screen, his hands trembling. It wasn't just Rachel. Derek had been doing this for years, cheating, lying, manipulating. He wasn't the friend Ethan had thought he was. He wasn't even close. He was a serial betrayer, someone who had taken advantage of the people who trusted him most. The realization hit Ethan like a tidal wave, crashing over him with a force that nearly knocked the wind out of him. He had spent years believing in Derek, defending him, sharing his life with him. And all along, Derek had been hiding this dark, twisted side of himself. Ethan felt his vision blur with tears, his throat tightening as the truth sank in. He had been betrayed, not just by Rachel, but by a man he had thought was his brother in all but blood. The pain was too much to bear. Greg walked back into the kitchen, his face tightening when he saw Ethan's expression. What did they say? Ethan handed him the phone, unable to speak. He watched as Greg's eyes scanned the email, his brother's jaw tightening in anger as he read. Unbelievable, Greg muttered, setting the phone down with a heavy thud. I knew Derek had issues, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined. Ethan buried his face in his hands, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him like a lead blanket. How could I not see it, Greg? How could I be so blind? Greg sat down next to him, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder in a gesture of comfort. This isn't on you, Ethan. People like Derek, they're good at hiding who they really are. They manipulate, they lie, and they make you believe in them. You trusted him because you're a good person, because you thought he was your friend. That's not your fault. Ethan wiped his eyes, trying to steady his breath. I don't even know what to do now. How do I move forward from this? How do I trust anyone again? Greg's expression softened. You take it one day at a time. You let yourself feel the pain, and then you start healing. It won't be easy, but you've got people who care about you, Ethan. You'll get through this. Ethan nodded, though the idea of healing felt impossible in this moment. The hurt was too raw, too overwhelming. But deep down, he knew Greg was right. He had to take it one step at a time, even if that first step was just getting through the day. Thanks, Greg, Ethan said quietly, his voice hoarse. I don't know what I'd do without you. Greg squeezed his shoulder. You're my brother, Ethan. I've got your back. Always. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Ethan felt a sense of resignation settle over him. He still didn't know what his future looked like, but one thing was clear. His friendship with Derek was over. There was no coming back from this. And as for Rachel, that was a decision he wasn't ready to make yet. But for now, he had his brother, and that was enough to keep him going. The weight of the revelation sat heavy on Ethan's shoulders, but somehow, with Greg's presence and the support he hadn't realized he needed, there was a sliver of relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. Knowing the full truth about Derek, how deep the betrayal ran, was painful, but it also gave him a strange sense of closure. The person he thought he had known for years didn't exist. Derek wasn't his friend. He was a master manipulator, and Ethan had been just another person caught in his web of lies. But now, there was only one loose end left, Rachel. As night fell, the house grew quieter. Greg had offered to stay up and keep talking, but Ethan told him he needed some time alone to process. So, now Ethan found himself sitting in the backyard, staring up at the stars, the cool autumn breeze brushing against his skin. Everything felt surreal. Just days ago, his life had seemed so normal, so routine. Now, it felt like his entire world had been flipped upside down. The thought of Rachel weighed heavily on him. He had spent hours trying to figure out what to do about her. Part of him wanted to give her the space to explain, to offer more answers than the empty apologies she had given before. But another part of him, the part that was still raw with pain, didn't know if he could even face her. Not after everything he had learned. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He hesitated, knowing that every message from Rachel felt like a new wound being reopened. But something made him look anyway. This time, it wasn't a message from her. It was from Greg, sent from inside the house. You good out there? Ethan couldn't help but smile faintly. Greg always knew when he needed to check in, even when he wasn't asking for help. Yeah, just thinking. I'll be in soon. Greg's response came quickly. No rush. Just let me know if you need anything. I'm here. Ethan pocketed his phone and sighed, leaning back against the chair. He thought back to the first time he had met Rachel, how easy everything had seemed in the beginning. They had fallen in love quickly, gotten married without hesitation. Their relationship had always felt strong, unbreakable, until now. Now, Ethan wasn't sure if that strength had been real, or if it had just been a fantasy he had convinced himself of. The betrayal had cracked something fundamental inside him, something that made him question whether he could ever trust her again. Could he forgive her? Could they rebuild from the ashes of everything that had been destroyed? As Ethan sat there, lost in thought, a realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Forgiving Rachel wasn't just about her. It was about him, about what he needed to heal. If he didn't find a way to either forgive her or let go, he would carry this pain with him forever, and it would poison everything in his life moving forward. The truth was, he had to confront her. Whether he chose to stay with her or not, he had to face the reality of what had happened, of the person she had become in the middle of their marriage. Only then could he decide what came next. Determined, Ethan pulled out his phone and opened the message thread with Rachel. He stared at her last message for a long moment, her words full of apologies and pleas for another chance. He didn't know if he was ready for that conversation yet, but he had to start somewhere. His fingers hovered over the screen before he typed out a simple message. "We need to talk." It was blunt, but it was all he could manage. He hit send before he could overthink it, his heart racing as he waited for a reply. He didn't have to wait long. Rachel's response came almost immediately. "Yes, please. Whenever you're ready, I'm here. I'll come to you. Just tell me where." Ethan stared at the message, his emotions swirling. He wasn't sure if he was ready to see her face to face just yet, but if they were going to have this conversation, it needed to happen soon. The longer he let it linger, the more toxic it would become. "Tomorrow morning," he typed. "Meet me at the park down the street from our house. 10 a.m. He didn't want to do it at home. That place held too many memories, too many ghosts. The park had always been neutral ground for them, a place they had gone to clear their heads, to talk about their future. Maybe it could be the place where they found some kind of closure, whatever that looked like. Rachel's reply came quickly. "I'll be there." Ethan stared at the screen for a moment longer before locking his phone and pocketing it. Tomorrow, he would finally face her, and he had no idea what would happen. The next morning came too quickly, the night offering little rest. Ethan woke up feeling more exhausted than he had the day before, his mind buzzing with anxiety about the upcoming conversation with Rachel. He got ready quietly, his movements mechanical, and by the time he was out the door, he could already feel the weight of what was coming. The walk to the park felt longer than usual. Each step felt heavier, as if his feet were dragging him towards something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But there was no turning back now. He had to get answers, real answers, and figure out if there was anything left to salvage. When he arrived, Rachel was already there, sitting on one of the benches near the swings. She looked nervous, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes darting around as if she wasn't sure what to do with herself. The moment she saw him, she stood up, her face softening with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Ethan," she said quietly, her voice trembling. He nodded, keeping his distance. "Rachel." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them almost unbearable. Ethan wasn't sure how to begin, how to navigate this minefield of emotions. But eventually, he spoke, his voice steady but strained. "We need to talk about what happens next," Ethan said, getting straight to the point. "I can't keep going like this. I need answers, and I need to figure out if there's anything left to fix." Rachel swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes as she nodded. "I understand. I'll answer whatever you need to know. I'm not hiding anything from you anymore, Ethan. I want to make things right." Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had so many questions, so many doubts, but there was one thing he needed to hear first. "Why? Why, Derek? Why didn't you come to me when things started to fall apart?" Rachel looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, Ethan. I was scared. I didn't want to admit that I was unhappy, that things weren't perfect. And Derek, he was there. It's not an excuse, I know, but I felt lost." Ethan felt a flash of anger rise inside him, but he forced it down, keeping his voice level. "So, instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix it, you turned to him? My best friend?" Rachel's tears spilled over, her voice breaking. "I made a terrible mistake, Ethan. I know that. I can't take it back, and I hate myself for it. But I need you to know that it was never about love. I never stopped loving you. I was weak." Ethan closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. He didn't know if he could believe her, didn't know if her love was enough to erase the betrayal. But part of him wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to move forward. But the bigger question still loomed over them. Could he ever trust her again? "I don't know if I can forgive you," Ethan said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." Rachel sobbed, her shoulders shaking as she wiped at her eyes. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes, Ethan. I'll go to therapy. I'll prove to you that I can be the woman you deserve. Just, please don't give up on us." Ethan felt his heart clench painfully in his chest. He wanted to say something, to offer her some kind of hope, but the truth was, he didn't know what he wanted anymore. He didn't know if their marriage was salvageable, or if the betrayal had destroyed everything beyond repair. "I need time," Ethan said finally, his voice steady but sad. "I need to figure out if I can ever trust you again." Rachel nodded, her tears falling freely. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here, waiting." Ethan turned and walked away, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He still didn't know what his next step would be, but for now, he had done what he needed to do. He had confronted Rachel, faced the truth, and now, it was time to decide what came next. Ethan walked away from the park, his heart heavy with the weight of the conversation he had just had with Rachel. The sound of her sobs still echoed in his mind, but he kept walking, his feet carrying him further and further from the place where everything had come crashing down. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stay there any longer. The streets were quiet as he made his way back toward Greg's house, the early morning sunlight casting long shadows across the sidewalks. Everything felt surreal, like he was living in some kind of parallel world where nothing made sense anymore. His life, his marriage, his friendships, it was all so tangled up in betrayal and pain that he couldn't see a clear way forward. Ethan's thoughts raced as he walked, his emotions swirling. Rachel had said all the right things. Her apologies had been genuine, her tears real, but none of that changed what had happened. She had still turned to Derek, still betrayed their marriage in the worst possible way. Could he forgive her? Could he ever look at her without remembering what she had done? And then there was Derek. Ethan still couldn't wrap his mind around the depth of Derek's betrayal, how the man who had been like a brother to him could have been hiding so many lies. The email from the stranger had confirmed what Ethan feared, that Derek wasn't just a man who had made a mistake. He was someone who had made a pattern out of deception, someone who had hurt others without a second thought. Ethan's phone buzzed again in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He hesitated before pulling it out, expecting another message from Rachel. But when he looked at the screen, he saw a name he hadn't expected, Derek. For a moment, Ethan considered ignoring it. He had told Derek to stay away, and he wasn't ready to have another conversation with him. But curiosity got the better of him, and before he could stop himself, he opened the message. "Ethan, I know you don't want to hear from me right now, but I have to say this. I understand if you never want to speak to me again. I've destroyed everything, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. But I need you to know that there's more to the story. Rachel wasn't the only one." Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he read the words. More to the story? His mind raced, his thoughts tumbling over themselves as he tried to make sense of what Derek was saying. Rachel wasn't the only one? Did that mean Derek was finally admitting to what the email had hinted at, that there had been others? The message continued. "I know you've probably heard things, and I won't deny them. I've made mistakes, worse than you can imagine. There's been more than one affair, more than one lie. I'm not proud of it, and I don't expect you to understand. But I couldn't let you go on thinking that Rachel was the only one. You deserve the full truth." Ethan's stomach churned as he read the words, his hands trembling. More than one affair. The truth hit him like a freight train, knocking the wind out of him. Derek had been lying to him for years, longer than Ethan had even realized. Rachel wasn't the first. She was just another name in a long list of people Derek had betrayed. Ethan stopped walking, his mind spinning. How had he been so blind? How had he let Derek manipulate him for so long? He had trusted him, confided in him, leaned on him during the hardest times in his life, and all the while, Derek had been hiding this dark side, lying to his face. Anger surged through Ethan, hot and blinding. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to make Derek feel the pain he had caused. But all he could do was stand there, his heart pounding, his hands shaking as he stared at the message. The truth was out now, and it was worse than he could have ever imagined. Ethan typed out a response before he could stop himself, his fingers moving furiously over the screen. "You're disgusting. I trusted you with everything. And this is what you were hiding? You've lied to me, manipulated me, and ruined my life. I never want to hear from you again. Don't ever contact me." He hit send, his chest heaving with anger as the message disappeared into the void. He didn't care what Derek had to say. He didn't care if Derek was sorry, if he regretted his actions. There was no forgiveness left to give. For a moment, Ethan stood there, his body tense with rage. But as the anger began to fade, it was replaced by something else, something colder, more hollow. Sadness. He felt it settle over him like a heavy blanket, pulling him down into a sea of grief. He had lost more than just a friend. He had lost years of trust, years of shared memories, years of believing in someone who wasn't real. And now, he was left standing in the ruins of his life, unsure of where to go from here. Ethan turned and began walking again, his pace slower this time. He didn't know where he was headed, but it didn't matter. The truth was out now, and there was no escaping it. When Ethan finally arrived back at Greg's house, the weight of everything that had happened that morning hung over him like a dark cloud. He pushed open the door, his steps heavy as he made his way inside. Greg was sitting in the living room, a cup of coffee in hand, but he immediately stood up when he saw the look on Ethan's face. "Hey, what happened?" Greg asked, concern etched into his features. Ethan sank onto the couch, rubbing his hands over his face. "Derek texted me." Greg's eyes widened. "What did he say?" Ethan handed Greg his phone, letting him read the message for himself. As Greg's eyes scanned the screen, his expression hardened, his jaw tightening with anger. "That bastard," Greg muttered under his breath, tossing the phone onto the coffee table. "I knew he was messed up, but this is beyond anything I expected." Ethan leaned back, his mind numb. "I don't even know what to do with this anymore, Greg. How do you move on from something like this? From knowing the person you trusted most has been lying to you for years?" Greg sat down next to him, his face softening. "You start by letting go of the idea that you could have seen it coming. This isn't on you, Ethan. Derek's a master manipulator. He's been fooling everyone, not just you." Ethan nodded, though the weight of Greg's words didn't bring much comfort. He had spent so long believing in Derek, in their friendship, and now that belief had been ripped away. What was left of his life after that? After losing Rachel and Derek in the span of a few days, what was left to hold on to? Greg seemed to sense his brother's spiraling thoughts. "You're stronger than you think, Ethan. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you'll get through this. And you don't have to do it alone. I'm here. Mom and Dad are here. You've got people who care about you." Ethan nodded again, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He was grateful for Greg's support, but it didn't change the fact that his world had been shattered. Picking up the pieces seemed like an impossible task. "I just don't know what to do next," Ethan admitted, his voice hoarse. "I don't know where to go from here." Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he looked at Ethan with quiet determination. "One step at a time, bro. That's all you can do. Don't think about the big picture right now. Just focus on getting through today, then tomorrow. The rest will come in time." Ethan swallowed hard, his chest tightening with emotion. Greg was right. He couldn't solve everything at once. He couldn't heal overnight. But maybe, just maybe, he could start with the small things, getting through each day, taking it one moment at a time. "I don't know if I can ever forgive Rachel," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Greg's expression softened. "And that's okay. You don't have to forgive her right now, or ever, if you don't want to. What matters is what's best for you, what you need to heal." Ethan stared down at his hands, the weight of everything pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, Greg was right. He needed to focus on getting through today, on finding some kind of peace in the chaos that had consumed his life. As the day wore on, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm begin to settle over him. It wasn't the end of his pain. He knew that much, but it was a start. A small step toward healing, toward finding a way to move forward, even if the path was still uncertain. For now, that was enough. The following days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next as Ethan tried to make sense of the chaos that had taken over his life. He spent most of his time at Greg's place, avoiding calls and messages from Rachel. She continued to text him, pleading for another chance, but Ethan wasn't ready to face her yet. He wasn't sure if he ever would be. He felt like he was drifting, stuck between the life he had known and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The trust that had once defined his relationships with Rachel, with Derek, had been shattered, leaving him with nothing solid to hold on to. He spent hours thinking, replaying every conversation, every moment, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that there were no simple answers. One evening, after days of reflection, Ethan sat on the porch of Greg's house, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. The cool breeze felt good against his skin, but it did little to ease the weight pressing down on him. He had been so focused on trying to make sense of everything that he hadn't allowed himself to just sit with his emotions, to process the grief, the anger, and the sadness that had been building inside him. Greg joined him on the porch, holding 2 beers, and handed one to Ethan. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the quiet of the evening wrapping around them. "You've been pretty quiet lately," Greg said finally, breaking the stillness. "How are you holding up?" Ethan sighed, taking a sip of his beer before answering. "I don't know. Some days, I feel like I'm starting to figure things out, and other days, I feel like I'm completely lost." Greg nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's normal, you know? There's no right way to deal with something like this." Ethan stared at the horizon, his thoughts drifting. "I keep wondering if there's a way back for me and Rachel, if I could ever forgive her, if we could ever rebuild what we had." Greg didn't respond right away, letting Ethan's words hang in the air. "Do you want to?" Greg asked eventually, his tone gentle. "Do you still see a future with her?" Ethan thought about it for a long time. There were moments when he did. Moments when he imagined that maybe, with time and effort, they could find a way to move forward together. But those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the deeper, darker emotions that had taken root since the betrayal. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice heavy. "I loved her, Greg. I really did. But now, I don't know if I can ever look at her the same way. I don't know if I can ever trust her again." Greg nodded, understanding in his eyes. Trust is the foundation of everything. Without it, a relationship can't survive. "I know," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's what scares me the most. I don't know if we can ever rebuild that trust." They sat in silence for a while longer, the quiet settling between them like a blanket. Ethan felt torn between the love he had once felt for Rachel and the pain she had caused him. He didn't want to give up on their marriage, but he also didn't want to stay in something that was broken beyond repair. Finally, Greg spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to decide right now, Ethan. You're still healing. Don't force yourself to make a decision before you're ready." Ethan nodded, grateful for his brother's steady presence. He had been putting so much pressure on himself to figure out the future, but maybe Greg was right. Maybe it was okay to take things one step at a time, to let himself heal before making any big decisions. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in soft shades of orange and pink, Ethan felt a small sense of clarity begin to settle over him. He still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he was starting to see a path forward, one that didn't involve rushing into a decision he wasn't ready for. "I think I need to talk to her," Ethan said quietly, surprising himself with the realization. Not to fix things, but to really face what happened. "I need to hear her out, for real this time." Greg looked at him with approval. "That's a good step, Ethan. No matter what happens, you deserve answers. And maybe it'll help you find some closure." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that decision settle over him. He wasn't sure what would come of it, whether he would find peace or more heartache, But he knew he couldn't avoid Rachel forever. He had to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next day, Ethan texted Rachel, asking if they could meet one final time. His message was brief, to the point. He didn't want to leave room for false hope. This wasn't about reconciliation, but about finding closure. Rachel responded almost immediately, agreeing to meet him that afternoon at their house. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach as he read her reply. He had spent days avoiding the place that had once been their home, but now, he knew he had to go back. He had to face her, face the memories, and make sense of what had happened. When he arrived, the house looked the same as it always had. The front yard was tidy, the porch light still on from the night before. But it felt different now, like the life they had built together was nothing more than a distant memory. Ethan stood outside for a moment, steadying himself before finally walking up to the door. Rachel opened it before he could knock, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked fragile, vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. "Ethan," she whispered, stepping aside to let him in. He nodded, stepping into the house that had once been their sanctuary. The familiar smells, the cozy warmth, it all felt foreign now, as if he were stepping into someone else's life. They sat down in the living room, the silence between them heavy and awkward. Rachel fidgeted with her hands, her eyes flicking up to meet his before quickly darting away again. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I know this isn't easy for you." Ethan took a deep breath, his hands resting on his knees as he tried to gather his thoughts. "Rachel, I came here because I need closure. I need to understand why this happened. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, but I can't move forward without knowing the truth." Rachel nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. "I'll tell you everything, Ethan. I promise. I've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of soul-searching, and I realize how much I hurt you. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that it wasn't because I stopped loving you. I never stopped loving you." Ethan looked at her, his heart aching. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that there was still love between them, but he knew that love alone wasn't enough. Not anymore. "Then why?" he asked quietly. "Why did you turn to Derek instead of me?" Rachel wiped her tears, her voice shaking as she spoke. "I don't have a good answer for that, Ethan. I was confused. I felt like I was losing myself in our marriage, like I didn't know who I was anymore. And Derek, he was there. He made me feel wanted, needed, and I got caught up in it. It wasn't love. It was a mistake. A terrible, selfish mistake." Ethan nodded, letting her words sink in. He had heard this before, but somehow, this time it felt more real. There was a rawness to her voice that hadn't been there before, a vulnerability that made him believe that, at least, she was telling the truth now. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady but full of sadness. "And without trust, there's nothing left to build on." Rachel nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me, Ethan. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry." The room fell into silence again, the weight of her words hanging between them like a heavy fog. Ethan stared at his hands, feeling the enormity of the decision that lay ahead. He could feel the love he once had for Rachel flickering faintly in the background, but it was buried beneath layers of pain, of betrayal. And no matter how much he wanted to reach for that love, he knew it wasn't enough. "I don't think I can do this anymore," Ethan said finally, his voice breaking. "I don't think we can come back from this." Rachel let out a soft sob, nodding as her heart broke before him. "I understand." Ethan stood up slowly, his chest tight with emotion. "I need time, Rachel. I need space. Maybe someday, we can figure out how to move forward, but right now, I can't stay here." Rachel looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, and nodded. "I'll wait. However long it takes, I'll be here." Ethan didn't respond. He turned and walked out of the house, his heart heavy with the finality of his decision. As he stepped into the cool afternoon air, he felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The love he had shared with Rachel was over, but in its place, he felt the first stirrings of something new: freedom, clarity, the possibility of healing. As he walked away from the house that had once been his home, Ethan knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in days, he felt like he could see a future. One that didn't involve holding on to the past, but instead, finding a way to rebuild himself, piece by piece. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. See you soon.